The padlock was on the wrong side of the door, and that was the first thing she understood about the place before she understood anything else. A root cellar is dug to keep a family fed through a hard season, and a family bars it from within when they are inside it, or latches it loosely from without when they are not. No one fits a forged staple and a heavy iron lock to the outside of a cellar dug into their own hillside, unless they mean to keep someone from what is in there or keep something from getting out into the light. Tess Marrow stood in the blue cold of a February morning with her bare hand flat against that lock, and she felt the cold of 30 winters come up through the iron into her palm. And she did not yet know whose hand had turned the key. The valley was called Holloway Draw, a narrow seam of bottomland folded between two timbered ridges in the southern mountains. And the man who sold her the abandoned homestead at the head of it had laughed when she counted out her money. $6 for the cabin, the fallen barn, the spring, and the cellar cut into the bank below the chimney. He said she had bought herself a grave with a roof, and the two men loafing by the land office stove laughed with him. And one of them said she would be back inside a month to ask for her $6 back. And the seller said the office did not give refunds on weather or on foolishness. Tess folded the receipt once and put it in the pocket of her apron and said she would not be back, and she walked the 4 miles up the draw with a borrowed mule and everything she owned lashed to its back. She was a mason's daughter, and that was the thing none of them thought to ask about. Her father had laid stone for 20 years before the consumption took him. Chimneys and foundations and the deep, cool walls of spring houses up and down 3 counties, and he had taught her every course of it from the time she was small enough to ride on his shoulder to the time she was tall enough to carry the hod herself. He used to say, "A wall remembers the hand that built it." He meant that a man who laid stone honestly left his honesty in the joints, and a man who cheated left that too, and a person who knew how to read a wall could tell which kind of hand had been there long after the hand was dust. She had not understood him as a girl. She came to understand him fully on the morning she put her palm against that lock, though it would be weeks before she knew why his words had risen in her at that exact moment, unbidden, like cold water from a covered spring. What she did not yet know was that the lock turned the wrong way was not the strangest thing the place was keeping. The cabin had stood empty 11 years. She learned the number later from a tax rendering, but she could read most of it that first day from the inside out, the way her father had taught her to read a building. 11 winters of wood smoke gone cold in the chimney. 11 springs of damp swelling and shrinking the door until it no longer met its frame. A pack rat's nest in the corner cupboard built up in patient layers, and she counted the layers the way you count rings in a stump and came near enough to a decade. The roof had held, which told her the man who shingled it had known his trade. The chimney had held too, and that told her more because a chimney is the hardest thing on a homestead to build true, and the first thing to fail when it is built false. And this one stood plumb and square after 11 years of frost, with not a stone shifted in its courses. She swept the cabin before she did anything else. She had nothing in her but the habit of work, and the habit carried her, when the size of what she had taken on would otherwise have sat her down on the cold hearth and kept her there. She swept and she hauled the rat's nest out into the snow, and she found beneath it a child's shoe, a single small boot of cracked brown leather with the laces still tied, and she held it a long moment in the gray light from the one window, and then set it carefully on the mantel, because it was not hers to throw away, and because a thing that was tied and kept did not deserve the snow. The shoe troubled her. She did not have a word yet for why. That night she slept on the swept floor in front of a small fire, and the chimney drew clean and true, the smoke rising straight up the flue without a curl back into the room, and she lay watching the firelight move on the underside of the mantel, and thought that whoever had built this chimney had been a better mason than the man who sold it had any notion. A false chimney smokes. A false chimney leaks heat through gap joints and pulls coal down the flue and fills the room with the proof of the hand that cheated. This one breathed like a living thing. She fell asleep, grateful for it, the way you are grateful for a stranger's confidence. And she did not yet suspect that the chimney was not only well built, but built to hold a secret, and that the man who built it had laid that secret into the stone with his own 2 hands and then been driven off his own land before he could come back for it. In the morning, she went down to the cellar again with the pry-bar. The cellar door was set into the bank below the cabin, a slanting double door of thick oak planks, and the lock held it shut against a hasp that someone had through-bolted, not nailed, which meant they had not wanted it pulled free with a bar. She tried anyway. She set the flat of the bar behind the hasp and put her weight into it, as her father had shown her, low and steady, never a jerk. And the oak groaned and the bolts held, and a cold thread of air came up out of the seam of the door and crossed her wrist. The air smelled of earth and old apples and something underneath that, something mineral and still. The smell of a space that had been closed for a long time and had made its own weather inside the dark. She stopped pulling. She stood and looked at the lock and thought about her father, and about how he would have looked at this, not as a problem of force, but as a problem of reading. A lock has a key, he would have said. And a key is hidden by a person, and a person hides a thing, the way that person thinks. And if you understand the hand, you can find the key without breaking the door. The cellar had no key. He had told her so himself, laughing, saying the last family had taken the key to the grave, or to wherever they ran to, and good riddance, and she could blast the door for all the office cared. The lock was not the office's lock, though. The lock belonged to whoever had stood here and turned it from the outside and walked away. And that person had either kept the key or hidden it. And a hidden key on a homestead this far up a draw was hidden close, because a key carried far is a key lost. She went back up to the cabin, and she stood in front of the chimney for a long time, and the thought came to her slowly, the way her father's lessons always returned, not as a flash but as a settling. A mason hides a thing in a wall. That is what a mason does that no other tradesman can. A carpenter hides a thing in a floor, and the floor is taken up. A smith hides a thing in the ground, and the ground is dug. A mason, though, lays a single stone a quarter-inch proud of its course, or sets one joint of mortar that is lime where the others are clay, or leaves a void behind a face stone that no eye will ever find because the wall is true. Her father had shown her such a void once in a springhouse wall, a dry pocket he had left to keep a deed in, and he had said that a wall was the only safe in the world, that a thief would not think to crack, because a thief looks for a box. She lit a candle, and she read the chimney, stone by stone. She started at the hearth and worked up, running the pads of her fingers, along every joint the way she had been taught to find a weeping mortar line in the dark, by feel and not by sight, because the eye is fooled by shadow, and the finger is not. The lower courses were river stone, rounded and set in a brown clay mortar, darkened by 11 years of smoke. Honest work. Tight joints. She went up. At the height of her shoulder, the stone changed to a quarried gray sandstone, dressed square, and the mortar there was a paler lime. And she stopped, because a mason does not change his stone and his mortar, both at the same height, in the same chimney. She found the stone above the firebox throat, the third course up on the left return, set just barely proud of its neighbors, a hair of a thing that no one would see and only a mason's hand would feel. She worked the joint with the point of an awl, patient, scraping the lime mortar out a grain at a time so as not to crack the face, and it took her the better part of 2 hours, and she did not hurry once. And when the stone finally came loose into her 2 hands, it left a dry square void behind it, the size of a loaf of bread, and in the void, wrapped in a square of oiled deer hide, gone stiff as board, was an iron key. Her hands were steady. She noticed that they were steady, and she was glad of it because her father had said a steady hand is the last thing fear takes and the first thing it gives back. She did not go straight to the cellar. And that was not patience for its own sake. The key in the oiled hide had been wrapped by someone who meant to come back for it, someone who had hidden it well enough to find again and trusted no one else to find it at all. And a thing hidden with that much care was a thing that mattered to its keeper more than gold, because gold you spend and run. And a thing you hide in a chimney and never come back for is a thing that was taken from you before you could unwrap the key fully in the window light. It was hand-forged, the bow worn smooth on one side from a thumb that had carried it, and tied to it with a rotted thong was a second small object, a flat brass disc stamped with a number she could not at first read for the tarnish. She rubbed it on her apron. It was a claim token, the kind a territorial land office struck and gave a man when he filed and proved a homestead. His number on it, his proof of patent. The number on this one was not the number on her receipt. That was the contradiction that opened the whole thing, though she did not see the bottom of it yet. She had bought this land at $6 from the county as an abandoned and tax-forfeited parcel under one number. The brass token in her hand carried a different number, an older one, a patent number from the Federal Land Office, which meant that before this place was a tax-forfeited parcel sold cheap to a fool, it had been a proved-up homestead patented to a man who had earned it with 5 years of labor and never abandoned anything in his life. Whatever the county paper said, man does not abandon a patent. A patent is the one thing on the frontier that cannot be taken by weather or by debt. It can only be taken by fraud. She sat down on the cold hearth, then the boot on the mantel above her, the key and the brass token in her lap, and for the first time since she had walked up the draw, she felt the size of the silence in the cabin, 11 years of it, and the child's shoe in it, and she understood that she had bought more than a ruin nobody else would touch. She had bought a question. You may already feel, as she did, that the wrong side of a lock is never an accident. Hold that. It matters more than she knew. She went down to the cellar in the last of the light and she fit the key to the lock, and it turned hard with the rust of years and then turned true, and the hasp fell open into her hand, and she lifted the slanting oak doors and the cold sealed breath of 11 years came up around her. The cellar was not empty. She had braced herself for a hard thing on the steps down, because a cellar locked from outside and a child's shoe on a mantel are 2 facts that leaned toward a third she did not want to find, and her father had drilled into her the habit of bracing for the worst of a wall before you open it, so the worst does not unsteady your hands. There were no bones in the dark, though there was a cellar that a family had stocked for a winter they never got to spend, and the stocking of it was the worst thing of all, because it was the proof of how sudden the leaving had been. Apple barrels, the apples long since fallen to brown dust, but the barrels still ranked along the wall, a crock of lard gone rancid and solid, strings of dried beans hung from the rafters, gnawed by mice to threads, seed potatoes in a bin, sprouted blind white in the dark and died, a whole Springs planting that was never planted. A family did not lay in a winter's keeping and then walk away from it. A family was put off it. And against the back wall, where the candlelight reached last, a wooden chest banded in iron, and it was not locked. She knelt in the cold and opened it, and the hinges were stiff, but they gave. And inside, dry because the cellar was cut so well that no damp reached the back wall, were papers. A family's whole paper life. A marriage lines folded in a Bible, a few letters in a careful schoolroom hand. At the bottom, flat and sound, a survey, plat, and a patent certificate, the patent number matching the brass token tied to the key, made out to a man named Josiah Held and his wife Rena for 240 acres of the bottomland of Holloway Draw, signed and sealed by the Territorial Register. Dated 9 years before the county had ever called this land abandoned. A patent dated before the abandonment. That was the whole fraud, in a single sheet of paper, and she held it to the candle and read it twice to be sure her wanting had not invented it. She did not yet know how the fraud had been worked, only that it had been, and she carried the chest up out of the cellar that night, a few papers at a time, the way you carry anything precious up a dark stair, and she laid them out on the swept floor in the firelight, read them through until the fire burned down and the story they told was not complete. But the shape of it was there, the way the shape of a wall is there in its foundation before a stone of it is laid. The next morning, she walked the 4 miles back down the draw, not to ask for her $6 back, but to find out who had wanted the Held family gone. She did not announce herself. Her father had taught her that you do not tell a wall you are about to test it. She went quietly into the county seat, a rail-end town called Drennan, 2 streets and a courthouse and a bank, and she went to the place where the truth of land is kept, the register of deeds in the courthouse basement, and she asked the clerk, an old man with ink-stained cuffs named Mr. Tyndall, to let her see the record of her own parcel, which was her right as its owner. He brought the book. What the book showed was this: 9 years back, a patent to Josiah Held, 240 acres, federal. Then nothing for 2 years. Then a notation of abandonment and tax forfeiture entered by the county assessor, and a sale of the forfeited land for back taxes to a man named Harlan Vexler, who had bought it for the taxes owed and held it, and rendered it for taxes himself for a few years. And that second forfeiture was the abandoned parcel the county had sold her for $6. Vexler had stripped the bottomland of its timber in the years he held it. She could see the timber sales rendered in the margin. He had taken the value out and let the husk go back to the county. The name meant nothing to her yet. She wrote it down. Harlan Vexler. The clerk watched her write it, and something moved behind his old face, and he said low that Mr. Full. Vexler was a man of standing in Drennan now, that he had built the new bank on the corner and held paper on half the farms in the valley, and that a young woman just up from nowhere with $6 would do well not to write that name down where a body could see her do it. She thanked him, and she folded the paper small, and she asked him one more thing. She asked him whether the original survey of the Held patent, the field notes the territorial surveyor had set down when he walked the bounds, were kept here in this book or somewhere else. The clerk's hands went still on the ledger. He said the field notes for that township had been lost. He said it in the flat, administrative voice of a man repeating something he had been told to say, and she heard the flatness in it, the way she heard a hollow joint when she tapped a wall, and she knew that the field notes had not been lost the way weather loses a thing. They had been lost the way a wall loses a stone that someone has pulled out on purpose. A surveyor's field notes are the one thing a forged patent cannot survive, because the notes describe the land as the land truly is. The bend of the creek, the lightning split oak on the corner, the lay of the bottom, and a forged claim can copy a number, but it cannot copy the land. If the Held patent was true, and Vexler's forfeiture was the fraud, the field notes would prove it, the creek and the oak matching the Held survey, and not whatever Vexler had sworn. If the notes were gone, no one could prove anything, and the gone notes were Vexler's defense, deliberate and patient, and laid in years ahead of any challenge, the way a careful builder lays his footing below the frost line. She had a forged-out patent on her side and a missing survey against her, and a man of standing who had taken pains years back to be sure no one could ever read the land against his paper. She went home up the draw, and she did not sleep that night, and somewhere in the dark hours the second lesson of her father's surfaced, the one that fit this exactly, and she sat up on the cold floor when it came. A wall remembers the hand that built it. The field notes were lost. The land itself was the original survey, though every survey only a copy of the land, and the land was still here, the creek still bending where it bent, the lightning oak still standing, or its stump still rooted, and any one corner of the held survey she could match to the ground in front of her was a field note no one had been able to lose. That was the surveyor's truth, though, and she was a mason, not a surveyor, and a corner post 9 years rotted in the ground would not be enough against a banker's lawyer, and she lay back down knowing the land would speak, but not yet how to make it speak loud enough for a court to hear. The answer was in the chimney, and she had already found it without knowing what she held. It came to her 3 days later while she was repointing the firebox, working lime mortar into the joints she had opened, because she could not leave a chimney she had cut into standing with open joints through the rest of the winter, and her father would have come up out of the ground to scold her if she had. She was kneeling at the hearth with her trowel, and her eye fell on the void where the key had been, the dry square pocket the mason had cut into his own chimney, and she thought, the way you think a thing you have known for days without saying it, that Josiah Held had been a mason too. No farmer cuts a hidden void into a chimney, true enough to hold for 11 years. No farmer changes his stone and his mortar at a marked height to tell himself where a thing is. The chimney that drew so clean, the chimney built better than the cellar had any notion of, had been built by a man who knew stone the way her father had known it, and a man who knew stone and knew his patent was under threat would not hide only a key. He would hide the thing the key protected. He would hide it where he hid the key, in the one safe, on the frontier. A thief does not crack, because a thief looks for a box, and a wall is not a box. She read the chimney again, all of it, the way she should have read it the first time if she had not been so taken by the key. And above the void, 2 courses up, on the right return this time, she found the second proud stone. And behind it, in a void cut twice the size of the first and sealed with a wax-dipped cloth against the damp, were the surveyor's field notes for the township of Holloway Draw. The original pages, not lost at all, gan carried off by the surveyor, who feared what the bank meant to do with them, and given for safekeeping to the one man in the valley with a wall that could hold them. She understood it all then, sitting back on her heels with the wax-dipped pages in her hands, and her own breath loud in the cold cabin. The surveyor had seen the fraud coming. Landmen and bankmen work the forfeiture trick up and down the territory, render a true patent, abandon through a clerk you owned, buy it cheap for the taxes, strip it, and the only paper that could undo you was the field notes that married a man's claim to the actual ground. So the bank made the field notes disappear. This surveyor, whoever he had been, had not let them disappear into a stove, though. He had carried them up the draw to Josiah Held, whose patent was the one most in danger, and Held the mason had laid them into his chimney behind a proud stone, and then Vexler had come with his forged abandonment and his deputies. With a winter's keeping already in the cellar, and a child's boot left on the floor in the haste of it. And Held, locking his cellar from the outside against the day he meant to return, had taken the key out of the chimney and hidden it in a second void, and never come back, because a man put off his land with falsified paper has no court that will hear him, and no money to buy one. And a man can die a long way from a draw with his proof still sealed in the wall waiting for a hand that could read it. 11 years it had waited. It had waited for a mason's daughter to buy a grave with a roof for $6 and put her bare palm against the wrong side of a lock. She wept then, once, briefly, and not for herself. Now she had everything and she had nothing, which is the hardest place to stand. She had the patent, the field notes, the brass token, the chest of a family's paper life. She had the proof that Holloway Draw had been stolen. The proof in her hands was by the strict letter of it, her proof. Now because she held the patented land, and a smaller person could have taken the held papers to a sympathetic court and quieted her own $6 title against the world, and walked away the lawful owner of 240 stolen acres, and called it justice, because the bank had lost. That was not a justice she could carry, though her father had a word for that kind of justice. He said, "A man who builds straight on a crooked footing has only made the crookedness taller." She did not want the held land. She wanted it given back to the Helds. That was the labor that took the rest of the winter, and it was not the labor of a pry bar. She had to find them, or find whoever was left of them, and she had to do it without Wechsler learning that the field notes had surfaced, because a man who had made the notes disappear once would not scruple to make them and her disappear together. She went carefully. She used the old clerk, Mr. Tyndall, who had warned her, and who she came to see had been waiting 11 years for someone to ask the right question, so that his own small guilt at filing the false abandonment under a banker's eye might be lifted off him before he died. He found her the trail in the church register and the burial book. Josiah Held had died 4 years back in a millworkers' town 200 miles east, a stonemason to the last, laying foundations for other men's buildings, his own land lost. Verena had died the winter after. There had been a daughter, though the child of the cellar and the boot, grown now to a young woman of 19, named Pella Held, in service in that same eastern town, who had no notion that the land her father had grieved for to his grave had ever been anything but lawfully lost. The boot on the mantel had a name now. Tess took it down and wrapped it and kept it for its owner. She wrote to Pella Held. It took her 4 drafts, sitting at night by the clean drawing fire, because she did not want to raise a hope she could not make good, and she did not want to frighten a girl in service with a letter full of banks and fraud. In the end, she wrote it plain. She wrote that she had bought a homestead at the head of Holloway Draw, and that in the chimney her father had taught her to read. She had found a key in a patent and a survey, and that the land had not been abandoned but taken, and that by the law of it the land was Pella's father's and now Pella's, and that she, Tess, meant to see it returned, and that there was a boot on the mantel she believed belonged to a child who had once lived there. She did not say more about the boot than that. Some griefs you set down in front of a person and let them pick up in their own time. She did not hear back for 5 weeks, and the waiting was its own crucible. Worse in its way than the cellar door, because a door yields to patience, and a silence 200 miles off does not. Wechsler learned of her before the letter was answered. That was the active turn of it, the thing her father would have called the wall pushing back, because a thing built false does not stand idle while you read it. The old clerk, Tyndall, came up the draw himself in the March mud, an old man who had not walked 4 miles in a decade, to tell her that Wechsler had been to the courthouse, asking who had bought the head of draw parcel and why she had been in the deed book, and that Wechsler had sent his agent, a lean, quiet man named Sly, who did the bank's hard errands, to ride up and look the place over. Tyndall said it the way you tell someone the frost is coming, not to frighten, but so they can cover the seedlings. He said Wechsler would not move against a lawful buyer of a county parcel in daylight. He said but the field notes were another matter. that if Wexler so much as suspected the notes had survived, he would have them out of her hands by fair means or the other kind, and that she should not keep them in the cabin. She did not keep them in the cabin. She put them back in the chimney, in the wax cloth, behind the proud stone, and she repointed the joint over them with her own lime mortar, so that the face was whole and true, and no eye and no hand, but a mason's, would ever find the seam. He came on a gray afternoon, and he was civil, and he was cold, and he walked the property with the air of a man pricing it, and he asked her had she found anything of value when she cleared the cabin, any papers, any goods left by the former tenants, because the bank, he said, held a residual interest and would want what was theirs. She told him she had found a rat's nest and a child's boot and 11 years of damp, and she said it, standing in front of her clean-drawing chimney, with her hands folded in her apron and her face as plain as the hearthstone. And Sly looked at the chimney and looked at her, and saw a poor woman in a cold cabin, which was exactly what she meant him to see. He left without searching, because there was nothing to search. A true wall is not searched. And he rode back down the draw and told Wexler there was nothing up there but a poor woman. Her father had been right about walls. He had been right about thieves. A thief looks for a box. Pella Held's letter came the next week. It was short, and it was in the careful schoolroom hand Tess had seen in the letters in the chest, the same hand grown older, and it said that Pella remembered the draw, though she had been small, remembered the cold of the cellar, and a red apple her mother gave her on the steps of it, and that she remembered her father saying to the end of his life that the land was theirs and the proof was in the wall, and that no one had ever believed him, and that they had thought it the grief talking. She wrote that she had wept to read that the proof was real. She wrote that she had no money for lawyers and no standing, and was only a girl in service. She wrote, last, that she would come, if Tess would have her, because she wanted to stand once more in the draw, whatever the law decided, and she wanted the boot. Tess wrote back one line. She wrote, "The land is yours, and there is a court that will say so, only come." There was such a court, but it was not the county court, because the county was where the fraud had been filed, and the county clerk who had filed it was the bank's, and the assessor was the bank's, and a fraud is not undone in the house that built it. The patent was federal. The field notes were the territorial surveyor's official record. A forfeiture for taxes cannot extinguish a federal patent that was never lawfully abandoned. The proof of unlawful abandonment was the field notes that married the held survey to the bend of the creek and the lightning oak, against whatever false description Wexler's man had sworn. The matter belonged before the federal land office and the territorial court, where Wexler's standing in Drennan was worth nothing, and his bank held no clerk. Pella came up the draw in April on the same kind of borrowed mule with everything she owned on its back. The way Tess had come, and the two young women stood in front of the cabin where Pella had been born, and Tess took the wrapped boot down from where she had kept it and put it in Pella's hands, and Pella held it. A small tied thing that did not deserve the snow, and neither of them said much, because some things are too large for the mouth and only the hands can carry them. Then Tess took her trowel and her chisel, and she opened the chimney one last time in front of Pella, so that the daughter could see the proof come out of the very wall her father had told her of, and no one had believed. And Pella watched the proud stone come loose, and the wax cloth come out of the dark, dry void. And she put her hand flat against the warm stone of the chimney her father had built, and she said low that he had not been lying. He had not been lying. She said it twice, and the second time was for him. The labor after that was paper labor, and travel labor, and the slow grind of a true claim through an honest office, and it was not the stuff of a single dramatic morning, and Tess did not pretend to herself that it would be. They went to the territorial seat together. They laid the patent and the field notes and the brass token before the Federal Register, and the Register, an unhurried man who had seen the forfeiture trick worked before and hated it the way an honest mason hates a false wall, walked the township, plat against the field notes himself, and found the bend of the creek and the lightning oak set down in the surveyor's own hand 9 years gone, and matched them to the ground, and saw that the description Wechsler's man had sworn to the county assessor described a different bottom entirely. Forged description, fitted over a true patent to call it abandoned. Wechsler made his defense, and it was not nothing, because a man who has worked a fraud for years has prepared the ground. He produced the assessor's sworn abandonment. He produced witnesses from Drennan, who swore the held place had stood empty and untended. He produced his tax title lawful on its face. He argued that the field notes were a forgery themselves, conveniently surfaced by a $6 speculator, and for a bad week it might have gone his way on the strength of his standing in his paper, because the office is slow and a banker is believed and a poor woman is not. What undid him was the land and the woman who could read it. The territorial court sent a man to walk the bounds, as the law allowed when a survey was contested, and Wechsler's lawyer was confident, because field notes 9 years old can be argued and a corner post can be moved. Tess had spent the winter doing the one thing no one expected of a poor woman with $6, though. She had read the whole homestead the way a mason reads a building, the skill her father had left in her hands, and she had found where the field notes said the southwest corner of the patent lay. Not a rotted wooden post that could be argued, but a corner monument of dressed stone, set deep below the frost line and squared true. Laid by Josiah held the mason in the season he proved up his claim, because a man who works in stone marks his corner in stone. The court's man dug where she told him to dig, and the monument was there, exactly where the surveyor's field notes said the corner stood, a stone set by the patent holder's own hand that married the paper to the ground beyond any lawyer's argument, and Wechsler's forged description, which had no stone under it anywhere, because it described a bottom that was never surveyed, had nothing to stand on at all. A wall remembers the hand that built it. So does a corner. Josiah Held had laid his honesty in the joints, and 11 years and his own death had not taken it out of the stone, and the stone spoke for him in the court that his living voice had never been let into. The Register voided the forfeiture. He found the abandonment fraudulent, the tax title void from its root, the patent never lawfully extinguished, and the land of Holloway Draw, the lawful property of the heir of Josiah and Verena Held, which was Pella. The matter of Wechsler's other dealings, the half the valley he held paper on, the field notes he had thought safely lost, passed out of Tess's hands and into the slow machinery of an office that now had reason to look at every forfeiture he had ever filed, and that machinery would grind for years, and Tess would not watch it. He was not dragged through a street. He was not shot down. He was simply at last read, the way a false wall is read, and a man whose whole standing was built on the belief that no one could read his paper found that the ground itself had kept the record, and his standing came down not in an hour, but over the seasons, joint by joint, the way false work always comes down once the weather gets into it. Tess did not take the held land. She had never meant to. She quit-claimed her $6 title to Pella for the same $6, so that the record would show a clean conveyance, and the cellar who had laughed at her and the 2 men by the stove heard of it, and did not laugh because a thing they could not understand had happened up the draw. A poor woman had bought a grave with a roof and turned it into the undoing of the man half of them owed money to. What Tess kept was the work. Pella, 19 and alone in the world and standing for the first time on the land her father had grieved for, asked her to stay, not as charity and not as a guest, but because the bottom land that had been stripped of its timber needed a hand that knew building, and the cabin needed a true mason to set it right, and the spring needed a spring house. And there was a whole homestead to raise up again out of 11 years of ruin. Tess stayed. It was not the warmth of two people drawing together against the cold. It was two solitary women and 240 acres, and the patient labor of making a stolen thing whole, which is the only justice that does not make the crookedness taller. She built Pella a spring house that first summer. Dressed stone laid in honest lime, deep, cool walls, and in the back wall of it, low, behind a face stone set just barely proud of its course, she cut a dry void the size of a loaf of bread, and she laid the original patent and the field notes into it and pointed the joint true over them, so that the proof would live where it had always lived best, in a wall, in the one safe on the frontier that a thief does not crack. Her father had kept a deed in a spring house, so she had not understood him as a girl. She understood him now with her trowel in her hand and the lime-drying gray on her wrists and a wronged man's daughter standing whole on her own ground in the sun. Over the years that followed, the draw filled in again. The bottom that Wexler had stripped grew back to pasture and then to corn, and Pella married a quiet farmer from the next valley and raised children in the cabin where she had been born. And the children grew up climbing on the corner monument of dressed stone at the southwest bound without ever knowing it had once stood up in a territorial court and spoken for a dead man. Tess never married and did not want to. She laid stone up and down the draw and into the next county the way her father had, and the masons who came after her learned to read a wall the way she read one. And it was told in Drennan for years that the proof had been in the chimney the whole time behind a single stone unreadable, until the mason's daughter came with $6 and a borrowed mule. The child's boot Pella did not put away. She set it on the new mantel of the rebuilt cabin, the way Tess had found it, a small tied thing that had waited out 11 winters in the snow, and on the evenings when the work was done, the two of them would sit at the clean drawing fire that Josiah Held had built to breathe like a living thing, and the boot would catch the firelight on the mantel above them, and neither of them needed to say what it meant. The heavy iron lock Tess kept too, the one that had been on the wrong side of the door. She did not throw it in the creek. She hung it on a nail by the cellar steps, open now, its key beside it, the cellar below it stocked again at last with a true winter's keeping, apples and lard and seed potatoes that would go into the ground in the spring and come up green. Every time she passed it, she touched the cold iron of it once with her bare hand, the way she had that first February morning when she had felt 30 winters come up through the metal into her palm, and had not yet known whose hand had turned the key. Now she knew. And the cellar was open. And it stayed open.